After a political career that saw him rise to the highest office in the land, Kevin Rudd returned to live in Queensland. It's where my crew are now heading.
I've got a clapperboard.
Even before he was Australia's Prime Minister, his knowledge of China was extensive. And he's just written a book which sets out in impressive detail why and how it is in Australia's national interest to engage with China while maintaining a close relationship with the United States.
Hold on.
He actually sets it out exactly what you need to do to keep both the relationship with China and America on track. This is The Big Picture. Hi, I'm Tim Harcourt. Welcome to The Big Picture. So Kevin Rudd, welcome to The Big Picture. I wanted to know what's your view of the big picture of China and Australia, the relationship, and how we can get it to a better place?
There are structural factors at work in the Australia-China relationship which all of us need to be aware of, and that is the reality of the US-China relationship. We cannot speak independently or separately of Canberra-Beijing unless we're also talking about Beijing-Washington. The truth is, we therefore have a relationship of strategic competition between Beijing and Washington over dominance in East Asia, dominance in the Indo-Pacific, and eventually dominance globally, economically and, I think, militarily. So whether we like it or not, we can't wish that away. It's a reality. Secondly, with the Australia-China relationship, like with Japan, like the Republic of Korea, and other allies of the United States in Asia, this therefore creates huge challenges in terms of managing our separate bilateral relationships with China. My argument, however, is that notwithstanding those structural tensions, that what we can do, both in Beijing and Canberra, is elect to bring the bilateral temperature of the relationship down. It may take, for example, the agenda shift of a change in government in Canberra in order to bring that about. But whether that happens or not, the bottom line is there will have to be political will in Canberra and Beijing.
I was interested in your book, The Avoidable War, that you mentioned that China's approach to Washington was very transactional. They wanted to keep, the Americans at hand so they could prosper economically and join the world economy. America, from Nixon onwards, saw it as very transformational rather than transactional, that somehow... Do you think that the US now knows that's perhaps more wishful thinking?
Yeah, I think in the United States there was a come to Jesus or come to Marx moment, depending on your definition, somewhere around about 2015, 2016. So I think there is now a reality check on both sides of the relationship, hence strategic competition, and hence our need as third countries, including Australia, to navigate our way around that reality, as opposed to pretending that reality doesn't exist.
Kevin's is a fascinating life story. He was raised on a dairy farm in regional Queensland. A farmer's son who not only went on to become Prime Minister, but a global leader and strategic thinker, who is now the President and CEO of the influential Asia Society. I was always interested in how you came to be interested in China as a kid in country Queensland without Chinese heritage or Chinese language around the place. How did you become interested in China personally yourself?
I think I decided at some stage I didn't really have a career in the future of Queensland animal husbandry. So if you're a kid growing up on a farm in rural Queensland and you're not particularly into all that side of the shop, and you're a bit bookish by instinct, which is you steal a book from the diminished shelves of the family library, jump on a horse and go to the far end of the property to escape hard work on the farm, you start to think about doing other things. And in my own case, it's not all that remarkable, Tim. I mean, we're all influenced by our mothers and to some extent our fathers. My mother was a self-educated woman, although she'd not gone much beyond primary school. And she would always make sure there was stuff around the house to read. And my early interest in China was triggered by a book she bought me on classical archaeology, which had just a bit up the back about Chinese classical architectural form. And then throwing me newspaper articles about Australia's early diplomatic recognition of China under Whitlam. These sort of things began to excite the imagination of someone who, when his father asked him once whether my career future was beef or dairy, ran screaming from the room. I think it's basically along those lines.
You picked that up and you took it to the ANU, and you actually not only became fluent in Mandarin, but you studied Chinese history, Chinese culture.
Well, the virtue of the Australian National University back in the Mesolithic period when I started studying Chinese was that they took a view that we needed a well-rounded understanding of the country, the culture, the civilization, for which language was the entry point. So we had to study modern Chinese, classical Chinese language, study the Confucian classics, study Chinese history, used to say from Yao to Mao, Yao and Shun. So having studied Chinese history and literature over that period of time, over 4 to 5 years of study, you do emerge out the end of it with a reasonably rounded view of the country. And we were benefited enormously by a great faculty of teachers at the ANU in those days.
And with your fluent Mandarin, you joined Foreign Affairs, and of course, they sent you to Sweden, which was very helpful for your language capability.
Yeah, it's sort of the universal logic of foreign services around the world. If you're really good at something, or think you are at least, then they'll throw you in exactly the reverse direction. And then I, of course, was cross-posted from there to our embassy in Beijing and got down to some serious work.
The interesting thing about Kevin Rudd is that he loves the language, he loves the people, but he's got a very nuanced, warts and all view of China. He knows it really well inside and out, and that makes him quite unique because he's not a Sinophile and he's not a Sinophobe. He's someone who knows all contours of China. That makes him very unique, particularly when he was Prime Minister. On his first visit to China as Prime Minister, Rudd addressed students at Peking University in Mandarin. Well, it was one of his first major speeches as Prime Minister, and being the first Mandarin Chinese-speaking Prime Minister we've ever had, and one of the few Western leaders who could speak Chinese, that was a big thing in China. It's arguably one of the most significant foreign policy speeches in Australian history. He told them that some people think that Australia and China are new friends, but in fact, our history is long. Now, I was quite struck when you were Prime Minister and you went to Beijing. You of course, launched my book at the Olympics, which was greatly appreciated. But you went to Peking University and made that speech where you talked about being a true friend of China as an Australian.
I mean, the speech was crafted largely by myself, but with a lot of input from some sinological colleagues. It was they who introduced me to the more classical concept of being a zhengyou, which is a Chinese friend, you being the operative word here, but one who would always be candid with his friends.
Now, you mentioned in that speech climate change and the need for China to have clean water and clean air into the future. Do you think that perhaps climate change could be a bridge for repairing some of the damage to the bilateral relationship?
I think in terms of, let's call it, political and diplomatic repair to the relationship, the first discipline that will need to be engaged in by both Beijing and Canberra would be to engage in a period of what I would describe as bilateral quietude. That is, stop screaming at each other. And I think there is some wisdom in that. I've always been critical of elements of the current Australian government's approach to China because they constantly conflate what I describe as operational diplomacy with declaratory diplomacy. That is what you're seeking to do as opposed to what you say on any given day of the week. And because they conflate those two approaches, there is a predisposition to take out the megaphone and simply to give it a good blast every Tuesday morning at 10 a.m. In order to pump up your hairy-chestedness within the Australian domestic body politic. So when I say agreeing on a period of, shall I say, public quietude, I don't say it just for fun. I think it's basically to provide us with an opportunity to reset the agenda and to draw breath. In the case of Australia, Tim, you also need, as I said, a conscious discipline in this country on the part of the political class to take the public temperature in the relationship down a bit. That of itself is not going to eliminate the fundamental strategic competition between China and the United States, nor our role within that, given our alliance relationship with the United States. But guess what? We've been an ally of the United States throughout our bilateral history with China, under Whitlam, under Fraser, under Hawke, under Keating, under Howard, under me. And guess what? The relationship has never reached the nadir that it has reached in the last several years. So I think there is an opportunity to bring this back to a greater level of equilibrium, while recognizing that the fundamental competitive nature of China's own worldview in relation to the United States and the collective West will fundamentally shape the strategic course of East-West relations. But we have an opportunity of navigating a way through more intelligently than has been done so far. Australia is in all sorts of climate change difficulty, and so we should be in the trenches with our friends in Beijing, collaboratively and constructively, in doing whatever we can to leverage both Chinese and Australian climate change action for the good of ourselves, for the good of China, and for the good of the planet.
Though they come from different sides of politics, former Prime Ministers Kevin Rudd and Malcolm Turnbull share something quite special. It's a bond many Australians also share. Family ties linking two nations. It's not politics, it's personal.
There are well over 1 million Australians of Chinese heritage, including 2 of our 4 grandchildren. So, I am to 2 of my 4 grandchildren.
Now, you've also got Chinese multilingual influence in your family because you now have Chinese-Australian grandchildren, just as I have Chinese children. So that's been quite something in your family going into the future now, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so. We've got 2 beautiful little grandkids who are Chinese Australians, and they, of course, have a deep interest in their ancestry, as they should.
I think he saw us dealing with the Chinese relationship together now with family ties as a very rich and very comprehensive relationship, not 2 strangers in the night. So it's interesting the role now of families with connections with China, myself included, that really impact Australia in a positive way.
Australia is the most successful multicultural society in the world. You could not imagine modern Australia without the contribution of Australians of Chinese heritage, and it's a big cohort, right? So it's well over 1 million. It's probably closer to 1.5 million people.
When I look at the face of modern Australia, and I look at kids like yours, grandkids like mine, my view is that it's all to the nation's strength, all to Australia's strength, that we continue to be enriched by one wave of migration after another, whether it's from China, whether it's from Korea, whether it's from India, whether it's from Southern Europe, whether it's from Eastern Europe, whether it's from Latin America. It's the way in which countries remain young in heart and in demographic reality. And if we start closing the door to all that sort of stuff, then I think we're sounding the nation's national economic death knell.
Going back to your family, your own daughter was an entrepreneur in China. What would you say to young Australians now looking at China as a future market? Do you think it's still a good place to grow an export business and to invest in, even under current circumstances?
I'm always mindful of what one of my former ambassadors in Australia said to me half a lifetime ago, who said that Australians who make money in China tend to be those who export in rather than invest in. for the simple reason that if you export in, you get paid FOB. And so therefore, if I was talking to young Australians today, it would be along the lines of think about what your firm produces by way of goods and services. Is there a demand for that in the Chinese market? Probably yes. Go in and work at that. But frankly, always be mindful of country risk, a country risk which accelerates if you're a direct investor in, and always, in the current environment, diversify your markets beyond China as well, given the country risk factors.
So the massive middle class, of course, a lot of opportunities, but it's important to look at markets all over Asia and the emerging world as well.
Absolutely. There is great growth in the rest of developing Asia. So I think a diversified approach to, frankly, export and investment makes a lot of sense. But given that China will be the gargantuan economic elephant in the world's economic living room for the next 20 or 30 years, you cannot ignore the Chinese economy. You need to embrace the opportunities while being fully mindful of the risks, hence why I've emphasized the importance of diversification.
Well, of course, my daughter was around 3 when you became Prime Minister. So for the early part of her life, she assumed the Australian Prime Minister could speak Chinese. So she's been a bit let down since then.
I'm sorry to disappoint her, but I was probably a bit of an outlier on that sort of stuff.
Kevin Rudd has had a fascination with China for almost half a century.
Okay, sure.
And sometimes what he has to say is best said in Mandarin.
大家好，我是陆克文，我正在澳洲。全世界还有那个疫情方面的问题，因此我待在这儿，我还没有回到美国去。一般来讲，我在美国，我当做那个亚洲协会的会长。我已经2年多了，没有办法到中国去访问，因此实在来讲，我觉得很感动。有中国这么多的朋友们，好久没有任何机会跟他们练习说话，因此我很喜欢我们未来有可能性，把我们的人与人的关系，把它们变成更密切。此外呢，我特别认识到最近呢那个澳洲中国关系越来越不好。我就是一个普通公民，没有什么政治的权利，没有什么政治的影响。但是我希望我们22年有机会把我们双边关系变成更好，变成越来越正常，变成密切的朋友。我认识到那个矛盾都很厉害呢，但是我认为如果我们两国人民能够抓这个机会，把这个双边关系改善一下，那么那个结果对我们两个国家的人民很了不起。谢谢大家。
It is always instructive listening to Kevin Rudd.
To make this great country of ours, Australia, even greater.
The country he ran not once, but twice. In short, he wants the best for both, which is why his words of wisdom are worth listening to and reflecting on.
I believe there is wisdom in what I describe as 4 or 5 core principles in governing the relationship. We should be clear with our Chinese friends that we can and should, given the enormous economic complementarities which exist between China and Australia, make the most of our bilateral trade and investment relationship and broaden the base of the economic engagement. I think that's productive. We should be collaborating on climate change, on global economic management, on global debt management, on future pandemic management, when inevitably we have a recurrence of something like COVID-19.
Kevin Rudd, thanks for appearing on The Big Picture.
Good to see you, mate.